All right, today we're going to talk about the third house and the eighth house and how to interpret charts where the two houses are combined. You can combine houses in two categories of ways. The first category is via the Lord, and the second is via the prominence. So as an example, for the first category, if you have the third Lord in the eighth house, then you're talking about a combination of the third and the eighth houses. Or if you have the eighth and the third house, same thing, or similar thing, actually. If the third and the eighth lords are joining each other or mutually aspecting each other, this is a way to get the third and the eighth house to work in concert. The other category of ways is not via the Lord, but via the prominence of the house. So, for example, if your third house is your most prominent and your eighth house is your next most prominent, or vice versa, if the eighth is the most prominent and the third is the next. Or if the third is the most positive and the eighth is the most negative, or vice versa, if the eighth is the most positive and the third is the most negative, then they reflect off each other. So the first way of looking at lordships is pretty easy to do. You just need a little bit of rudimentary knowledge about astrology. The second way of assessing the prominence of houses and the positivity of houses is difficult. So I have a report that will do it for you. You can go to my website, victicare.com, click into the reports section, and look for the report called The Houses of Life. If you order that report, you'll get this kind of code, the DNA code of the houses. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the two houses separately. Once we're clear on what the third house represents and what the eighth house represents, then we can start talking about what happens when you combine the two. So first of all, to understand the third house, just keep in mind where it is in the sky. It's below the ground. It's in the lower quadrant, but it's on the eastern border of the lower quadrant. And that is the key to what it symbolizes. East represents self and tangibility, and underground represents the internal being. So the third house is all about the ability to manifest desires and to manifest concepts, so make them real. And the third house is all about desire to achieve things for yourself. Those are the two backbones of everything that third house represents. Because it's the house of ability, this is the house for skills and talents. Skills and talents means the ability to realize things, right? To accomplish things, to achieve things. And because it's the house of skills, it's also the house of strengths and strength. And because of where it is on the eastern border of underground, it symbolizes assertion. It's like the fourth house, which is the middle of the underground. The fourth house is your feelings. The third house is on the border of it to the east. So it's like the feelings trying to express themselves and become real. So it's assertiveness and forcefulness and strength. And also, this is what the third house has to do with willpower, and bravery, courage, and discipline. Because it's forcefulness and strength, particularly as it relates to feelings having an effect on the real world. And so it's also about desire. That's the other strand of meaning in the third house, because desire is what we feel inside that we want to accomplish in the real world. So the third house, being the house of desire, is the house for our passions. The motivation, the motivating factors in our life, the lusts or the drives, they come from the third house. And since we're talking about the eastern side of the fourth house, we're talking about desires directed towards the self, right? So the third house is very self-oriented or individualistic. It indicates strength and courage to be able to do things on your own, not need help. So it's for independence and individuality. And finally, a very important thing about the third house is that it's competitive, because it's all about desire and ambition. You want to achieve goals. Well, now you have to compete with other people who are achieving the same goals. So you have to compete with peers. So these two things, come into the domain of the third house. Competition itself, competitiveness, all kinds of things that are variations on competition, like fighting, on sports. And then your people that you contest with. So your peers, not your superiors, not your inferiors, not your juniors, not your seniors, your peers, your brothers, your sisters, your classmates. That's in the third house. Now, you understand a good deal about the third house. Actually, if you just keep this chart in mind, you can make sense out of anything that the third house might represent, because everything that the third house might possibly represent in some context is just some kind of variation on something that's already listed up here. So now that we have the third house under wraps, let's do the same thing for the eighth. And again, it's the same with every house. To understand what the house really represents, just consider where it actually is in the sky. So the eighth house is a part of the western quadrant. And it's the quadrant that's centered on the western horizon, but it's the upper border of the western quadrant. So it's the actual lower atmosphere that's above the ground in the west. So what it signifies is things that erode or weather whatever the west signifies. The west has three important things that it signifies. Invisibility, because it's where the sun sets. Death, because it's where the sun sets. And other people, because it's where the sun sets. The sun represents the I, the ego. Okay, so the eighth house, everything about the eighth house is organized around these three themes. That it will erode or extract from or weaken invisibility, death, and other people. So let's look at the first thing first, the invisibility strand. The eighth house is anti-invisibility. It can reveal invisibility. So a very important thing about the eighth house is it's all about secrets and knowing secrets, being able to know secrets. This is why it's the house of mysticism. That's what mysticism means, mystery. Piercing into a mystery is a mystic, a person who deals with mysteries. The eighth house is the mysterious place because it deals with secrets. And the mystic is the person who understands the secrets or pursues the secrets. This is why it's such an important house for astrology or any kind of occult, magic, etc. And also stuff like psychology, where it's the secret part, the thing that you don't see, but the inner working of something. Furthermore, the eighth house is very, very analytical, because the idea is it will be able to pierce the outer shell and go into the true secret that's on the inside. So it has the piercing quality of an analyst or a critique or a critic. The eighth house is very critical and analytical. It will be able to dig past the show and get down to the real business. So this is also why it's very good with research and detective things. Now, the other thing about the west is that the sun setting there makes it signify death. So the eighth house is going to erode death. This is why it's called Ayushbhava in Sanskrit, or the house of longevity, the house of our life force, the house of our vitality. People mistake it as the house of death when it's actually the house of life. But by understanding the amount of life that's coming from the eighth house, you understand your death and how much time you got. So indirectly, you'll see the person's death, let's say, from the eighth house, but it's because what you're actually seeing is the span of their life, how long they'll live. And because it's anti-death, then it's going to have to do with procreation. So the eighth house has to do with sexuality and reproduction, and therefore it's a pretty sexy or charismatic place. Charisma in the sense of non-intellectual attraction to things, just hormonal attractions or biological attractions that are for the sake of reproduction. And thirdly, that west deals with other people because it's where the sun sets. So the 8th house has to do with eroding or extracting from other people. So it's what you're taking from others in your partnerships. So this is a reason why it is the house of inheritance. And inheritance is an umbrella term for a lot of things, like, for example, gifts. And also the whole concept of money that you get as a result of your partnership or relationship with somebody else, so like joint income. It's not really independently earned income, but it's income which is either given to you from other people, or you just acquire from other people, or you may actively take from other people. And if you're going that far to say you're actively taking it, then we might as well call it something else. We can call it sales. The 8th house has a lot to do with sales and salesmanship. Because it's the ability to take from other people. And here, actually, it comes to be an asset that the 8th house is also very good with secrets. Because if you are good with secrets, then you know how secrets work. And if you know how secrets work, then you can manipulate secrets. You can be deceptive. And if you can manipulate facts and things, then you can sell things a lot easier. All right, so now you know what you need to know about the 3rd house and the 8th house. Now we're able to talk about what happens if we combine them via their lords or via their prominence. Whenever we try to combine anything in astrology, we always follow a simple format, which is what you say, what does thing A have to do with thing B? What do they have in common? The 3rd house has so many things that it's about. The 8th house has so many things that it's about. Out of all those things, which ones are the same? Is the 3rd house about something which is basically the same or basically exactly opposite to what the 8th house is about? If so, it's very important, and that's what you have to focus on. So in this case, the 3rd house, it's all about giving to yourself. The 8th house is all about taking things from others. So it's kind of difficult to make up our minds about whether they're talking about the same thing, the 3rd and the 8th house, or whether they're talking about something opposite. So this is going to be one of those house combinations where it makes a big difference. Because which house has the focus or the dominance? Because you can look at it either way when you look at the 3rd and the 8th house. So you'll want to consider which house has the focus and use that consideration to determine how you look at this. Basically speaking, let me show you the 3 key points that are active when you compare the 3rd and the 8th house. First of all, the 3rd house is the house of independence, but the 8th house is the house of joint assets. So that's struggling with each other, so it's going to make you wonder if this person knows how to cooperate or not. The other thing is the 3rd is the house of force, and the 8th is the house of life force or vitality. So they both seem to generate force. So we're going to wonder if this person is strong or not strong. And finally, the 3rd house is the house of passion or lust, and the 8th house is the house of sexuality. So we're going to think the person is libidinous or very ambitious or driven, has a high drive, or not. So here's how to work it out. Now that we know these are the 3 basic focuses, let's talk about how to decide which angle to take on it. If you find that the 8th house is the focal point, you'll interpret these 3 things in a certain way. Or if you find that the 3rd house is the focal point, you'll interpret them in the opposite way. How will you determine whether the 8th or the 3rd is the focal point? If you're dealing with house lords, it's simple. If you have the 8th lord going into the 3rd house, then the 3rd house is the focal point. If you have the 3rd lord going to the 8th house, then the 8th house is the focal point. That's easy. If you have 3rd and 8th connecting by conjunction, then you have to see which planet is dominant over the other. That's not as easy. You have to know how to figure out dominance. If you have 2 planets doing mutual aspect, then you have to also, on top of the dominance thing, consider which planet has greater aspect on the other. If you're looking at your house code, like the one that you get from my report, and you find the 8 comes first, and it's followed by a 3, then it's 8th house dominant interpretation. Vice versa, if you find a 3 comes first and is followed by an 8, then it's third dominant. Or if you see 8 on the left, it's 8 dominant. If you see 3 on the left with the 8 on the other side, or the other number on the other side, the one that's on the left will be dominant. All right, so that's how you determine whether 3 or 8 is dominant when they combine. And now you'll base your interpretations of these 3 basic issues based on which house is dominant. If the 8th house is dominant, to borrow a quote from the classics, this person is described as the usurper. Usurper, I don't know how to pronounce it. And if the 3rd house is dominant, they're caricatured as a weakling or a weak person. So that in and of itself is very, very interesting. It really encapsulates a lot. But let's break it down and explain a little bit about what's intended by these words. What does usurper mean? If you have the 8th house as the focal point for a 3 and 8 combination, it means, yes, this person is very passionate. They're very driven for themselves. And they will be intent on taking what they feel they deserve or taking what they want from other people. They will do so using 8th house assets, which means they will use secrecy or mystery to their advantage. So you could describe their approach to fulfilling their ambitions as subversive or guerrilla warfare. It's not going to be noble, straightforward, forthright ways of going about fulfilling their desires. And you'll find that this person is, in terms of the cooperation things, you'll find that they are rebellious and that they have the ability to rise out of submission, or they have the ability to rise out of poverty. So are they strong? Yes, they're very strong. Are they ambitious and libidinous? Yes, very. Are they cooperative? Not particularly. They're rebellious. And they are kind of self-motivated in terms of the partnerships. So that's what we mean by usurper when you have 3 going into 8, or 8 is somehow prominent over 3. The other one, the other side of the coin, the weak one, is when you have the 3rd house be prominent. This person is the opposite. Are they strong? No. Are they ambitious and libidinous? No. They've lost. The clash between selfishness and jointedness has fizzled things out symbolically. So they're lazy people, meaning they don't get motivated very much. They don't have a lot of motivation, and they're difficult to motivate. So they're not the type that rises out of poverty. They're the type that just becomes satisfied with being an employee and getting a regular paycheck. Therefore, they are not really the ideal type, like the ideal husband or something. They don't really find it easy to support other people because they're not particularly ambitious. Therefore, they're not making a lot of cash. All right, so that's the theory behind the 3rd house and the 8th house. You, of course, want to realize that this is one factor out of many in any chart. And if you watched any of my other videos, you'll see how interesting it is to look at real charts and see how 2 people with the same placement can come out to be actually quite different. But this is the basic theory behind how to interpret the 3rd house and the 8th house acting together in isolation from everything else. If you like this video, give it a like. If you're interested in finding out what your sequence of houses are, to see if maybe you have houses like this working together that you didn't know about, then let me remind you one more time to go to my website, victorcara.com, go to the report section, and find the Houses of Life report and order that. And subscribe to the channel so that I see you next time when we do the 3rd house combining with the 9th house, or my other video which will come first, which will be Jupiter and Scorpio, or the live streams that I do twice a week. Thank you very much for watching.